By the year 1934, the famous architect Frank Lloyd Wright was 67 years old, and many people in the architectural world believed that his most important work was already finished. After years without a major project, and during the difficult time of the Great Depression, critics began speaking about him as if he were a talented designer whose moment of greatness had already passed. Some writers openly called him a has-been, and they claimed he was a leftover from the 19th century, which was their way of saying that he no longer mattered in a world that was becoming modern and fast-changing. At the same time, the Great Depression had made life difficult for almost everyone, and it was especially hard for architects because families and businesses stopped building when money became tight. Since fewer people were paying for new homes, offices, and public buildings, most architects struggled to find clients, and Frank Lloyd Wright, who already had a damaged reputation because of older scandals and personal trouble, found it even harder to get work. Even important groups in the art world seemed ready to move on without him, because the Museum of Modern Art in New York had recently put together an exhibit about modern architecture and treated Wright as only partly modern, as if he were a stepping stone rather than a leader. By this point, Wright had not completed a major building in many years, and he spent a lot of his time talking about big ideas and drawing plans for future cities that no one paid to construct. Most people who were his age and in his situation would have accepted that their career was ending, but Wright did not want to be remembered as a talented man who ran out of time. Instead, he waited for a new chance, even if that chance seemed unlikely, and then, without warning, one phone call gave him exactly the opening he needed. A rich client and a sudden deadline. The phone call came from Edgar Jonas Kaufman, a wealthy department store owner from Pittsburgh, who wanted a weekend home in the mountains of Pennsylvania, where the air was cleaner and the forests felt far away from the smoky city. At first, it sounded like a normal request, because rich families often hired architects to design vacation houses, especially during times when city life felt stressful and noisy. However, the situation became unusual because Frank Lloyd Wright accepted the job, but then did almost nothing for 9 months, even though the Kaufman family expected to see drawings, plans, and progress. During that long stretch of time, the family wrote letters asking about the design, and Wright responded with calm promises and vague statements, which made it sound like he was working even though no one could point to a real plan on paper. Then, in September of 1935, the client finally lost patience, and Edgar Kaufman called Wright to say that he was driving to Wisconsin and wanted to see the drawings in person. Wright understood that he was about to be exposed because the truth was that he did not have the design ready and the client was close enough to arrive within hours. Instead of panicking in a way that made him freeze, Wright reacted in a way that shocked the people around him because he calmly walked into the drafting room, sat down at his table, placed a map of the site in front of him, and began drawing as if he had been preparing for this moment all along. According to apprentices who watched him, Wright designed the house in one powerful rush of focus, and within about 3 hours, he produced a plan that would later be seen as one of the boldest house designs in American history. The house that looked impossible. What Wright drew that day became Fallingwater, a house that was not simply built near a waterfall, but was designed to sit directly above it, so that the rushing water would run under the home like a living part of the building. Instead of using a style that made the house look separate from the land, Wright created long concrete terraces that stretched outward like natural rock ledges. And he used thick stone walls that looked as if they were growing out of the hillside itself. The design felt so daring that many engineers looked at the plans and warned that the concrete terraces might crack or collapse, because the balconies pushed far out over the stream without obvious supports underneath. Even so, the drawings were so beautiful and so dramatic that the Kaufman family could not ignore them, and the public later became just as fascinated because the house looked like it was defying gravity while still appearing to belong to the forest and the rocks around it. Fallingwater did not become famous only among architects who studied buildings for a living, because ordinary people also cared about it once photographs spread through magazines. The house became such an important symbol of American design that it even appeared on the cover of Time magazine, which was a huge sign that Wright had returned to the center of public attention after years of being treated like an outdated figure. However, the story of Fallingwater was never just a happy tale about a genius creating a masterpiece, because almost from the beginning, the house struggled with problems that were hidden behind its beauty. the concrete began to crack earlier than anyone wanted to admit. Parts of the terraces slowly sagged as time passed, and water and moisture constantly attacked the building because it stood above a moving stream, which made maintenance difficult and expensive. Many decades later, engineers concluded that the structure needed major help, and only a multi-million-dollar rescue effort in the 21st century stopped the house from sliding towards serious failure. Today, Fallingwater is protected as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the American Institute of Architects has called it the greatest American work of architecture of all time, while millions of visitors have walked across the same terraces that once made engineers nervous. To understand how such a house was even possible, though, you first have to understand the family that paid for it, and the man who risked everything to design it. The Kaufman family of Pittsburgh. The Kaufman story began long before Fallingwater existed, because in 1868, a 19-year-old German farmer's son named Jakob Kaufman stepped off a ship in New York Harbor with very little money, but an enormous amount of hope. Like many immigrants, Jacob had left behind a life where opportunities were limited, and he came to America believing that hard work could lead to success, even though many people discovered that the promise of America was not always easy to reach. Jacob quickly proved that he was serious, because within a few years, he sent for his brother Isaac Kaufman, and together they opened a small tailor shop in Pittsburgh at 1916 Carson Street in an area filled with workers and immigrant families. The shop was small, measuring only 17 feet by 28 feet, and their starting investment was about $1,500. But they treated it like the beginning of something much larger, not like a temporary job. Their business grew quickly enough that the brothers were able to bring more family members from Germany, and soon Morris Kaufman arrived in 1872 when he was only 14, while Henry Kaufman followed in 1876 at 16, which meant that four brothers were now running a growing company in a city built on steel, coal, and the labor of people who were trying to build new lives. What made the Kaufman brothers successful was not only that they worked hard, but also that they paid attention to new ideas in shopping and business, because they recognized that department stores were changing how Americans bought things. Instead of bargaining over price, people liked the simplicity of fixed prices, and instead of asking clerks to fetch items from behind a counter, shoppers enjoyed seeing goods displayed out in the open, which made shopping feel more exciting and modern. Because the Kaufmans understood this shift early, they expanded, and by 1890, they moved to an important downtown corner at Fifth Avenue and Smithfield Street, where their store grew into one of the most well-known places in Pittsburgh. A bronze four-faced clock stood outside, and it became so famous that people began telling each other, "Meet me under the Kaufman clock," which was something the city repeated for generations. By the time the family reached the early 1900s, the business had turned a group of hard-working immigrants into wealthy leaders, and it was into this world that Edgar Jonas Kaufman was born on November 1st, 1885, as the eldest son of Morris Kaufman. Edgar was raised with privileges that his immigrant relatives never had, and he received elite education, attending Shadyside Academy and then studying at Yale University, where he learned how to move comfortably among the upper class. After college, Edgar traveled and trained in retail management in Europe before returning to Pennsylvania, and even though he first tried running a smaller store in Connellsville, he soon joined the family business in 1909, starting at a basic job as a shipping clerk. That same year, he married Lillian Kaufman, who was the daughter of his uncle Isaac, and because first cousins were not allowed to marry legally in Pennsylvania at the time, they traveled to New York to hold the wedding there. Their marriage strengthened the family fortune, and in 1910, they had one child, Edgar Kaufman Jr., who would later become one of the most important people in the Fallingwater story. Edgar Sr. rose quickly in the business world, and by 1913, when he was only 28, he had gained controlling interest in the department store and became president, overseeing a company that employed around 3,000 people. Over the next several years, he pushed the store to become larger and more impressive, tripling yearly sales from about $10 million to $30 million, while also treating the store as something like a public stage for art and culture. He commissioned murals about the history of commerce, renovated the ground floor with a stylish French Art Deco look, and helped turn Kaufman's into more than a place to shop, because it became a cultural symbol of Pittsburgh's success and ambition. Lillian Kaufman matched his energy in her own way because she believed that beauty and design could improve people's lives. And in 1933, she redesigned the store's 11th floor into the Vendôme shops, which were named after a fancy square in Paris. One part of that floor featured designer clothing from New York and Europe, while another part displayed antiques, crystal, and finely crafted decorative objects. And newspapers often described Lillian as one of the most stylish women in Pittsburgh. Still, even with all their money and influence, the Kaufman family could not break every barrier, because in the 1930s, many elite social spaces excluded Jewish families, and certain clubs and registers did not fully accept them. Rather than spending their lives begging for approval, the Kaufmans built their own circle by supporting artists, architects, and intellectuals. And they created a world where culture and creativity mattered more than old social rules. When Albert Einstein visited Pittsburgh in December 1934 for a scientific conference, the Kaufmans hosted him at their Fox Chapel estate. And Edgar Kaufman, who spoke German, even helped as Einstein's interpreter, which showed that the family wanted to be connected to ideas, not only wealth. Pittsburgh's air, filled with smoke from steel mills, gave the family another reason to escape whenever they could. Because soot covered buildings and darkened the sky, so wealthy families often traveled to the Laurel Highlands to breathe cleaner air among forests and streams. The Kaufmans discovered their favorite retreat at Bear Run, a rushing creek in the mountains, and because the land had once been a summer camp for store employees, it already had cabins and a clubhouse, which made it useful as a getaway. When employees stopped using it, Edgar and Lillian Kaufman bought the property in July 1933, and they built a modest cottage where they could spend weekends resting and enjoying nature. They especially loved a flat boulder near a waterfall where they would picnic, swim, and listen to water crash over ancient rock, and although they saw it as their favorite family spot, they had no idea that an architect would one day choose that exact place as the heart of an unbelievable design. The life of Frank Lloyd Wright. Long before the house called Fallingwater was ever imagined, the man who would design it had already lived a life full of bold ideas, personal struggles, and painful tragedies. The architect Frank Lloyd Wright was born on June 8, 1867, in the small town of Richland Center, Wisconsin, where rolling hills and open farmland surrounded his childhood home. His father, William Carey Wright, worked as a traveling preacher and musician, which meant the family moved often and never stayed in one place for very long. This unstable life created tension in the household, and eventually the marriage between Wright's parents began to fall apart. However, Wright's mother, Anna Lloyd Jones Wright, believed strongly that her son was destined to become a great architect, and she encouraged that dream long before he was old enough to understand what architecture even meant. When Frank was still a small child, Anna decorated his room with pictures of beautiful European cathedrals and famous buildings, hoping that those images would inspire him and shape the future she imagined for him. Although Wright later attended the University of Wisconsin, he did not stay long enough to complete a formal degree, because he was impatient to begin working in the real world. In 1887, when he was only 20 years old, he traveled to Chicago, which was quickly becoming one of the most exciting cities in the country for architects and engineers. At that time, Chicago was rebuilding after the Great Chicago Fire, and many talented designers were experimenting with new ideas about skyscrapers and modern buildings. Wright soon found a job at the well-known architectural firm Adler & Sullivan, where he worked under Louis Sullivan, a brilliant architect who believed that buildings should express their purpose and not simply copy old historical styles. Louis Sullivan became Wright's mentor, and during those years, Wright learned how to think about architecture in a completely new way. Instead of treating buildings as decorative objects, Sullivan believed that form should follow function, which meant the shape of a building should grow naturally from the way people used it. This idea strongly influenced Wright and would stay with him throughout his life. The rise of a young architect. By 1893, Wright felt confident enough to open his own architectural practice, and he began working from a studio attached to his home in Oak Park, Illinois, where he lived with his wife, Catherine Tobin Wright, and their growing family. During this period, Wright developed a style that later became known as the Prairie style, which was very different from the tall, crowded Victorian houses that were common in America at the time. Instead of designing homes with many small rooms and steep roofs, Wright created buildings that stretched horizontally across the land, with long, low roof lines that echoed the flat landscapes of the American Midwest. Inside these homes, Wright removed unnecessary walls so that rooms flowed into each other, creating open spaces that felt comfortable and natural rather than stiff and formal. Large bands of windows allowed sunlight to enter and connected the interior spaces with the outdoors, which helped people feel that their home was part of the surrounding environment rather than separated from it. Between 1900 and 1910, Wright designed around 50 prairie-style houses, and many critics praised his creativity and originality. One of the most famous homes from this period was the Frederick C. Roby House in Chicago, which many historians still consider one of the finest examples of prairie architecture ever built. At this point, Wright appeared to be at the peak of his career, and many people believed he would continue shaping American architecture for decades. However, his life soon took a dramatic and shocking turn: scandal and public shame. In 1909, Wright made a decision that would damage both his personal life and his reputation. He left his wife Catherine and their 6 children in order to run away with a woman named Mama Borthwick Cheney, who was the wife of one of his clients. Their relationship created a major scandal, and newspapers across Chicago reported the story with sensational headlines that embarrassed Wright and angered many of his former supporters. In a time when society expected strict behavior from public figures, Wright's actions shocked the community and caused many clients to stop trusting him. To escape the criticism and gossip, Wright and Mama Cheney traveled to Europe, where they lived quietly for a period of time, while the scandal slowly faded from the headlines. When Wright eventually returned to the United States in 1911, he discovered that many potential clients no longer wanted to work with him, and the reputation he had built through years of hard work had suddenly become fragile. Because of this rejection, Wright decided to retreat to land owned by his Welsh relatives in rural Wisconsin. On a hill overlooking the countryside, he designed and built a new home and studio called Taliesin, which was named after a Welsh word meaning shining brow. Taliesin became both Wright's home and a place where he could continue developing his ideas about architecture while staying away from the criticism of city life. For a brief time, it seemed that Wright had found peace again, but tragedy soon struck in a way no one could have imagined. A terrible tragedy. On August 15, 1914, while Wright was working in Chicago, a shocking crime took place at Taliesin. A servant named Julian Carleton suddenly attacked the people living in the house after setting parts of the building on fire. As the flames spread, Carleton used a hatchet to attack those who tried to escape. By the time the violence ended, 7 people had been killed, including Mama Borthwick Cheney and her 2 children. The event was horrifying and deeply traumatic, and news of the attack spread quickly across the country. When Wright returned and saw the destruction, he was devastated. But instead of abandoning the property, he chose to rebuild Taliesin on the same site, believing that the place still held meaning for him. Unfortunately, more trouble followed in later years. In 1925, a second fire damaged Taliesin again, forcing Wright to rebuild the structure once more. Although these disasters tested his strength, Wright continued working and trying to revive his career. Personal struggles and new beginnings. Wright's personal life remained complicated. After the tragedy at Taliesin, he married Miriam Knoll, a sculptor, but their relationship quickly became unstable, and the marriage eventually ended in divorce in 1927. The following year, Wright married again, this time to Olgivana Lazovic, a dancer from Montenegro who was nearly 30 years younger than he was. Unlike his previous marriages, this relationship lasted for the rest of Wright's life, and Olgivana became an important supporter of his work and ideas. Even though Wright still believed in his creative vision, the world around him was changing and his opportunities were shrinking. When the stock market crashed in 1929, the Great Depression began, and construction projects disappeared almost overnight. Hotels, office buildings, and luxury homes that had been planned before the crash were suddenly canceled because investors no longer had money to spend. One large project Wright had hoped to build in Arizona collapsed before construction even began, leaving him without the major commission he desperately needed. To survive financially, Wright began giving lectures and selling Japanese prints from his personal collection, which had been one of his longtime passions. Although he continued to draw bold designs and talk about new ideas for cities of the future, very few clients were willing to hire him. A reputation in decline. In 1932, the Museum of Modern Art organized an important exhibition about modern architecture, featuring designers such as Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe, who were becoming famous for their sleek, minimalist buildings. When the exhibit mentioned Wright, it treated him more like a historical influence than a modern leader, which made it seem as if his creative period had already ended. That same year, Wright and Olga Vanna decided to open their home, Taliesin, to students who wanted to learn directly from him. For $550 a year, apprentices could live at Taliesin and work alongside Wright while helping maintain the property and assist with design projects. Critics mocked the program, calling it a vanity project created by an aging architect who was trying to stay relevant. Wright also published his autobiography, where he explained his belief in something he called organic architecture, which meant that buildings should grow naturally from their environment in the same way that plants grow from soil. Unfortunately, the book did not sell well, and by 1934, Wright appeared to be an aging architect with big ideas but very little work. At that point, he was 67 years old, and most people assumed his most important buildings had already been designed. Then, unexpectedly, the Kaufmann family entered his life. Edgar Kaufmann Jr. and the architect. Although the Kaufmann department store was the center of the family business, Edgar Kaufmann Jr., the only child of Edgar and Lillian Kaufmann, did not feel excited about spending his life selling merchandise or managing store departments. From an early age, he showed strong interest in creative work, such as painting, drawing, and design, which made it clear that his talents were very different from those of his father. Because the Kaufmann family valued education and culture, his parents supported these artistic interests and encouraged him to explore the world beyond Pittsburgh. As a young man, Edgar Kaufmann Jr. traveled to Europe, where he studied at the School for Arts and Crafts in Vienna, a place known for teaching students how to combine practical skills with artistic creativity. After spending time in Vienna, he moved to Florence, Italy, where he continued studying art and typography under the respected craftsman Victor Hammer. During those years, Edgar learned how thoughtful design could shape the way people experienced everyday objects. And he developed a deep appreciation for architecture, art, and craftsmanship. Even with this education, however, he returned to Pittsburgh in his early 20s, feeling somewhat uncertain about what direction his life should take. The family business waited for him, but he was not sure that managing a department store would satisfy his creative instincts. Everything changed during the summer of 1934, when a friend recommended that he read the recently published autobiography of Frank Lloyd Wright. Discovering Wright's idea. When Edgar Kaufmann Jr. began reading Wright's book, he quickly became fascinated by the architect's ideas, which spoke directly to feelings he had struggled to explain before. Wright argued that buildings should grow naturally from their surroundings, rather than being forced onto the land in ways that ignored nature. According to Wright, architecture should serve human life instead of dominating it, and he believed that the best buildings created harmony between people, materials, and the natural world. These ideas strongly affected Edgar because they matched many of his own thoughts about beauty and design. The book gave him language for ideas he had always felt, but never clearly understood. After finishing the autobiography in only a few days, Edgar felt such excitement that he decided to write directly to Frank Lloyd Wright, asking if he could visit Taliesin, the architect's home and studio in Wisconsin. To his surprise, Wright agreed. On September 27, 1934, Edgar Kaufmann Jr. traveled to rural Wisconsin and finally met the famous architect in person. Their conversation lasted for many hours, and Edgar listened carefully, while Wright explained his philosophy about architecture, nature, and the future of cities. By the end of their meeting, Edgar had made an important decision. Only a few weeks later, on October 15th, he paid the tuition and officially joined the Taliesin Fellowship, becoming one of Wright's apprentices. Life at Taliesin. Life at Taliesin was very different from a normal university or art school because Wright believed that architects should learn not only by studying drawings, but also by working directly with materials and the land. Each day began early in the morning, when apprentices woke up and helped prepare breakfast for the entire community. After breakfast, they spent several hours in the drafting room, where they worked on drawings and plans related to Wright's projects. In the afternoons, the apprentices often left the studio and worked outside, performing tasks such as farming, building structures, repairing buildings, or carrying stone from nearby fields. Wright believed that architects needed to understand materials like wood, stone, and concrete with their own hands rather than only through theory. The community also shared meals together, and during the evenings, Frank Lloyd Wright often spoke to the group about architecture, philosophy, art, and the future of civilization. These conversations could last for hours, and many apprentices later said that simply listening to Wright think out loud was one of the most valuable parts of their education. Students paid $550 per year to live and study at Taliesin, which covered room and board, but the program offered no formal degrees or certificates. Instead, apprentices gained something more unusual: the chance to observe a legendary architect while he worked, and to absorb his ideas directly. For Edgar Kaufman Jr., the experience was exciting and inspiring, even though he soon realized that he did not want to become a professional architect himself. After about 6 months, he decided to return to Pittsburgh, where he accepted a position managing the home furnishings department at the family store. This role allowed him to use his design knowledge while still participating in the family business. However, his time at Taliesin had another important result. While living there, Edgar had written many enthusiastic letters to his parents describing Frank Lloyd Wright, the studio, and the powerful ideas he was learning. Those letters eventually made his parents curious. The Kaufmans' visit. Taliesin. On November 16, 1934, Edgar and Lillian Kaufman traveled from Pittsburgh to Wisconsin to see Taliesin for themselves. During their visit, Wright welcomed them warmly and spent the day showing them the property, the studio, and photographs of his earlier architectural projects. The Kaufmans were impressed not only by Wright's work, but also by his personality, because he spoke with confidence and enthusiasm about design, craftsmanship, and the relationship between buildings and nature. During dinner that evening, the conversation turned toward the Kaufman family's property in Pennsylvania, which they used as a quiet retreat from the noisy industrial city. They described the forests, the rocky hillsides, and the rushing stream that ran through their land at Bear Run. They also explained that the small cottage they had built there no longer felt large enough for their growing needs. As Wright listened carefully, he became curious about the site and asked many questions about the landscape, the shape of the creek, and how the water behaved during different seasons. Before the visit ended, the Kaufmans invited Wright to travel to Pennsylvania and see the property himself. The visit to Bear Run. A few weeks later, on December 18th, Frank Lloyd Wright arrived in Pittsburgh. Edgar Kaufman Sr. picked him up and drove him southeast through the mountains toward the family's property in the Laurel Highlands. When they reached Bear Run, the weather was cold and the forest was quiet, with winter air drifting through the tall trees. The two men walked slowly across the property, studying the land and listening to the water rushing through the narrow valley. Eventually, Edgar Kaufman showed Wright the family's favorite location, which was a wide, flat boulder that extended out over the stream near a small waterfall. During warm weather, the family often gathered there to swim, relax in the sun, and enjoy picnics beside the flowing water. Because the spot was so beautiful, Edgar assumed that any new house would probably be built nearby so that the family could look at the waterfall from their windows. However, Wright did not immediately share his opinion. Instead, he quietly observed everything around him. He studied the rock formations, the direction of the stream, and the way the trees surrounded the area. He took photographs and made measurements while asking questions about flooding, seasonal changes in the water, and the shape of the land beneath the soil. Throughout the visit, Wright said very little about where he planned to place the house, and he did not show any sketches to his client. When the day ended, Wright returned to Wisconsin with many observations stored in his mind. The Kaufman family waited for drawings. Winter passed, then spring passed, then summer passed as well. For 9 months, no plans arrived. 3 hours that changed architecture. During those long months, Frank Lloyd Wright repeatedly told the Kaufman family that he was thinking carefully about the design, and he suggested that the idea needed time to grow in his mind before it appeared on paper. Some of his apprentices believed him, but others suspected that Wright was simply delaying the work because he often had difficulty beginning projects until pressure forced him to act. Finally, the pressure arrived on the morning of September 22, 1935. That day, Edgar Kaufman Sr. telephoned Taliesin from the nearby city of Milwaukee, which was about 140 miles away. He told Wright that he was already on the road and planned to arrive by lunchtime to review the drawings for his new house. The moment Wright hung up the telephone, he walked directly into the drafting room where several apprentices were working. Without showing any sign of panic, he sat down at his drafting table, placed a map of the Bear Run property in front of him, and began drawing. According to Edgar Toffel, one of the apprentices who watched that morning, Wright worked with extraordinary speed and focus, sketching the design as if the entire building already existed inside his mind. First, he drew the main floor, placing the living spaces directly above the waterfall instead of somewhere downstream where the family could simply look at it. Then he extended wide concrete terraces outward from a central stone core, allowing them to project dramatically over the rushing stream. Above the main level, he added a second floor with additional terraces, and finally a smaller third level at the top of the composition. As Wright worked, he spoke aloud about the life the Kaufman family would live in the house. He imagined Lillian and Edgar drinking tea on the balcony while listening to the sound of the water, and he described how they would cross small bridges to walk through the forest surrounding the house. While Wright continued sketching, the apprentices sharpened pencils and handed him fresh ones as the points wore down. After about 3 hours, the design was finished. Soon afterward, Edgar Kaufman Sr. arrived at Taliesin, expecting to see months of work carefully prepared. Instead, Wright handed him drawings that had been created that very morning. At the top of the plans was the name Fallingwater. Building the house. Above the water. After Edgar Kaufman. Sr. studied the drawings that Frank Lloyd Wright had created in only a few hours. He realized that the design was both exciting and unsettling at the same time. The house looked beautiful on paper, but it also seemed risky because the wide concrete terraces stretched far out over the waterfall without obvious support underneath. When Kaufman first looked at the drawings, he told Wright that he had expected the house to sit near the waterfall so that the family could enjoy the view from a safe distance. Wright calmly explained that he had chosen a completely different idea because he did not want the waterfall to be something the family merely observed through windows. Instead, Wright said he wanted the Kaufman family to live with the waterfall so that the sound of rushing water would become part of their everyday life, and the house itself would feel connected to the landscape around it. Although Kaufman was unsure about the bold design, he and his wife Lillian Kaufman continued studying the drawings carefully after returning to Pittsburgh. They even asked engineers to examine the structure because they wanted to be certain that the concrete balconies could support their weight safely. Some engineers warned that the design might be too ambitious, but the beauty of the idea continued to impress the Kaufman family. Eventually, they agreed to move forward with the project, trusting Wright's creativity even though they understood that the house would be expensive and complicated to build. Construction began in April of 1936, and the work took place in a quiet forest area where narrow mountain roads made it difficult to bring in heavy equipment and building materials. The contractor responsible for the project was Walter J. Hall, a builder from northern Pennsylvania who had experience working on challenging sites but had never attempted anything quite like Wright's daring design. Local workers from nearby towns were hired to help with the construction, and many of them had limited experience with unusual architectural projects. These laborers earned between 35 and 85 cents per hour, depending on their skills and responsibilities. Each morning, they traveled through the wooded hills to reach the site, where the sound of the rushing creek echoed through the valley while they worked. Using materials from the land. One of Frank Lloyd Wright's strongest beliefs was that buildings should feel like natural parts of the landscape rather than objects that were simply placed on top of it. Because of this philosophy, he insisted that many of the materials used in Fallingwater should come directly from the surrounding land. An old sandstone quarry on the property had been abandoned years earlier, but workers reopened it in 1935 so they could extract stone that matched the natural rocks along the stream. These pieces of sandstone were stacked carefully to form the thick vertical walls of the house, creating the impression that the structure was rising naturally from the hillside. The horizontal terraces, however, required a completely different material. For those projecting platforms, Wright used reinforced concrete, which was poured into wooden forms and strengthened with steel rods placed inside the mixture. The concrete itself was made from a blend of cement, sand, and small pieces of gravel taken from the creek bed below the house. While Wright believed strongly in his design, Edgar Kaufman Sr. remained cautious about the engineering details. Because he wanted to protect his investment and ensure the safety of his family, he hired independent consulting engineers to review the structural calculations. When the engineers studied the plans, they expressed serious concerns. They warned that Wright had specified too little steel reinforcement for the long concrete terraces, and that the balconies might sag over time under the weight of the building. A quiet compromise. When Kaufman shared these warnings with Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect became frustrated and defensive. Wright believed that the engineers were thinking too cautiously and applying old-fashioned ideas to a bold modern design. The disagreement quickly grew tense, with Wright insisting that his calculations were correct, while Kaufman demanded reassurance that the structure would be safe. Caught between the two men was Walter Hall, the contractor responsible for actually building the house. After listening to both sides, Hall made a quiet decision that he did not immediately tell Wright about. When workers installed the steel reinforcement inside the concrete terraces, Hall added extra steel rods beyond what Wright's drawings required. In fact, the main balcony eventually contained almost twice as much steel reinforcement as Wright had originally specified. This hidden compromise allowed construction to continue without further arguments, although Wright never fully approved of the change. Life inside. Fallingwater. By the autumn of 1937, the main structure of Fallingwater was finally complete, and the Kaufman family moved into their remarkable new home. From the outside, the house looked dramatic and unusual, but the interior spaces also surprised visitors in many ways. One of the first things people noticed was the low ceiling height, because many rooms measured only about 6 feet 8 inches tall, which felt slightly lower than most homes. Wright intentionally designed the ceilings this way so that the indoor spaces would feel more intimate, while the open terraces outside would seem even larger and more expansive by comparison. Inside the house, the rooms flowed smoothly into one another without many walls or doors separating them. The entry area, living room, and dining space were arranged as one continuous environment, allowing people to move freely through the space without feeling confined. Large windows surrounded the rooms, and in some places the glass panels met at the corners without visible supports. By removing the vertical frames usually found at window corners, Wright created wide views of the forest so that visitors could see the surrounding trees from many angles at once. In the center of the living room, Wright included one of the most unusual features in the entire house. A large natural boulder rose directly through the floor beside the fireplace. This was the same rock where the Kaufman family had once sat during their outdoor picnics, and Wright refused to remove it because he believed it was an important part of the land's history. Instead of clearing the stone away, he designed the fireplace around it so that the house would always remind the family of the place that had inspired the design. Living with the stream. Another remarkable feature of Fallingwater was a hidden staircase located beneath a glass hatch in the living room floor. When the hatch was opened, a narrow set of stairs descended directly from the house down to the stream below. This unusual design allowed the Kaufman family to walk from their living room straight to the rushing water within moments. For Wright, this was not simply an interesting architectural trick. He believed that people should experience nature with all their senses, not only by looking at it from a distance. By placing the house above the waterfall and allowing easy access to the creek, he made the sound and motion of water a constant part of daily life. Even the colors inside the house were chosen carefully to match the landscape outside. Wright limited the entire building to only 2 main colors, a soft golden shade for the concrete surfaces and a deep Cherokee red for the steel elements such as railings and window frames. These colors reflected the natural tones of the surrounding sandstone and autumn leaves. Wright also designed much of the furniture himself. More than 170 pieces were built specifically for the house using black walnut wood, and many of them were permanently attached to the walls. Wright believed that moving furniture around would ruin the balance of his design, so he sometimes described these built-in pieces as client-proof, meaning that the owners could not rearrange them. The Kaufman family accepted these unusual decisions because they trusted Wright's vision and admired the beauty of the finished home. Cracks begin to appear. Even though Fallingwater looked strong and solid when construction finished, small problems began appearing sooner than anyone expected. When workers removed the wooden supports that held up the concrete terraces during construction, thin cracks quickly appeared along the walls where the balconies connected to the main structure. When Edgar Kaufman noticed these cracks, he immediately asked Frank Lloyd Wright for an explanation. Wright responded calmly and insisted that minor cracks were normal in the concrete structures, explaining that the material often shifted slightly as it settled into place. However, as the years passed, the terraces continued to sink very slowly. The change was so gradual that many people barely noticed it at first, but measurements later showed that the large balcony outside the living room had dropped several inches below its original position. Engineers eventually realized that the problem was caused by something called creep, which occurs when concrete slowly bends under continuous weight over long periods of time. Although the extra steel reinforcement added by Walter Hall helped strengthen the structure, the balconies were still carrying more weight than Wright had originally planned. The location of the house also made the problem worse, because constant moisture from the waterfall and mist rising from the stream slowly weakened the materials. Flat roofs designed by Wright sometimes leaked during heavy rainstorms, and the Kaufman family often placed buckets beneath dripping ceilings while workers repaired damaged surfaces. Despite these frustrations, the house remained beautiful and fascinating, and visitors from around the world began arriving to see it. Fame and recognition. In January of 1938, just months after the Kaufman family moved into Fallingwater, Frank Lloyd Wright appeared on the cover of Time magazine, which featured a drawing of the house behind his portrait. The magazine described Fallingwater as Wright's most beautiful achievement and praised the building as one of the most imaginative homes ever created. Only a few years earlier, many critics had dismissed Wright as an outdated architect, but Fallingwater suddenly reminded the world of his extraordinary talent. Soon afterward, the Museum of Modern Art in New York organized a special exhibition dedicated entirely to Wright's work, and architectural journals printed detailed photographs showing the dramatic terraces hovering above the waterfall. Famous architecture critics, including Louis Mumford, began praising Wright again and calling him one of the greatest architects alive. As a result of this renewed attention, Wright received many new commissions. He designed the Johnson Wax Administration Building in Wisconsin, which opened in 1939 and featured a large open workspace supported by slender columns shaped like lily pads. Later, he began planning a remarkable museum for art collector Solomon Guggenheim, a spiraling building in New York City that would eventually become the famous Guggenheim Museum. This new success proved that Wright's creativity had not faded with age. In fact, nearly 1/3 of all the buildings he designed during his life were created after Fallingwater, when he was already in his 70s and 80s. A house that became a legacy. For more than 26 years, the Kaufman family traveled regularly from Pittsburgh to Fallingwater, where they spent weekends and holidays surrounded by the quiet forest and the steady sound of the stream below. Friends and famous guests often visited the house, including artists, designers, and architects who wanted to see Wright's masterpiece for themselves. However, the Kaufman family also faced personal tragedy during these years. In 1952, Lillian Kaufman died at Fallingwater after taking an overdose of sleeping medication. Although the exact circumstances were never fully explained, the loss deeply affected the family. Her husband, Edgar Kaufman Sr., died only a few years later in 1955, leaving their son, Edgar Kaufman Jr., as the sole heir to the property. Understanding that the house was too important to remain private forever, Edgar Jr. eventually decided to donate Fallingwater and the surrounding land to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy in 1963, so that it could be preserved and shared with the public. The house opened for tours in 1964, allowing visitors to walk through the rooms and terraces that had once belonged only to the Kaufman family. Decades later, engineers completed major restoration work to strengthen the sagging terraces and protect the building from further damage. Today, More than 150,000 people visit Fallingwater each year, and the house remains one of the most admired examples of architecture in the world. What began as a risky design drawn in only a few hours by an aging architect has become a lasting symbol of creativity, imagination, and the powerful connection between human design and the natural world.